As you know, I'm dealing with crises and depressions, and there are several very good reasons why we should take an interest in these happenings. One is that we need to be able to expose the silly claim of the Tories and the Labour Party that they know how to abolish them. They can't and they won't. Another reason is that some of the wrong theories about crises and depressions have been used to build up theories about the way capitalism will collapse and socialism will arise out of the ruins, and it's necessary to know where they have gone wrong and what the real explanation of crises and depression is. The subject itself is a bit complicated, but most of the complication arises out of the fog of unsound theories that have been built up round it. In other words, you've got to clear them away before you can usefully deal with what is actually going on. Marx covered a lot of the ground, and most of his conclusions have been confirmed by later events, but there are a few developments in capitalism since Marx's day that have made some not very important differences that are worth noticing, even if they are not very important in themselves. One other thing to remember is that each crisis and depression has to be looked at in relation to its own circumstances. They, so to speak, they don't follow a close pattern. You can't say that every one that comes along is just like all the ones that preceded it. If you want to see what confusion there is among economists and politicians, all you have to do is to look at their explanation of the present depression. You'll find that one lot say that the causes are entirely monetary, but even that lot can't agree among themselves, because half of them say that what they choose to call the money supply is too great, and the other lot say that what they choose to call the money supply is too small. Others say, of course, that crises and depressions are due to the greed of trade unions, or faults in the taxation system, or the unwillingness or inability of the banks to lend money to industry. All of the modern economists set out with the assumption that there must be somewhere some policy that would enable them to run capitalism without crises and depressions. They've been looking for it for a couple of 100 years, and none of them have found it, and they're still looking. And if that were not so, of course, they would be able to agree among themselves about the whole subject. None of them recognise, as did Marx, that the cycle of booms and depressions is simply the way capitalism operates, and that there is no remedy within capitalism. Before I deal with the real causes of crises and depressions, there is a question of terminology to be looked at. You've got to remember that the term crisis and the term depression means quite different things. It's important because the factors that cause a crisis are quite different from the factors that operate after the crisis and when the depression actually begins. In several passages in Marx's Capital, he described the cycle that capitalism goes through. One of them is in volume 3, page 423 in the Kerr edition. This is how he lists them. The first phase he calls condition of rest. That's when capitalism is in a depression. The next phase is increasing activity of production, when production is expanding again. The third phase is what he called prosperity, when business is booming and unemployment is very low. Then overproduction, then crisis, and after the crisis, the stagnation or depression, like the one in which we are at the present time. By crisis, Marx meant the sudden interruption of a boom. Everything seems to be going well, business is booming, low unemployment, and quite suddenly you get a reversal. That is what Marx meant by the crisis. And he meant by stagnation and depression the period, short or long, that follows after the crisis, and as I say, you have to keep the two separate. So you've really got three distinct questions to consider. What causes a crisis? What causes a depression? And of course the other question, what causes a depression to give way to expansion again? I'm now going to deal with some of the erroneous theories, and remember that at this stage I'm dealing simply with theories about the cause of crisis. Well, one of the erroneous theories is that a crisis is caused because the workers can't buy back the whole output of industry. Now, it is, of course, a fact that the workers can't buy back the whole output of industry. But if you start using this as an explanation of a crisis, you immediately get into a dilemma. The workers never can buy back the whole output of industry. Wages and salaries never are enough to buy everything that is produced. So if their theory is correct, that crises are caused by workers not being able to buy back, crises wouldn't happen, as Marx said, about every 10 years or something like that. They would happen every week and every day. You would have continuous crises. You would, in fact, have a permanent crisis or permanent depression, according to whichever way you look at it. Now, Marx, of course, said that no crisis lasts forever, and Marx was correct. So if you're going to use this argument that crisis takes place because the workers can't buy back, as the workers never can buy back, crisis would be continuous. The people who hold that erroneous view have made two other assumptions to get themselves out of the dilemma. One of their assumptions is that during the period of expansion and boom, there is every week a quantity of commodities that are produced and cannot be sold. And then they say these things pile up in factories and warehouses and shops until they get so huge they can't be carried any longer, and then a crisis occurs. But in fact, unsold stocks do not pile up in the period of expansion and boom. In the boom, it's the seller's market, and it's in that time that stocks run down because everything that's produced can be got rid of. So that assumption won't work. Their second assumption is that the workers can't buy back the whole output of industry, and the capitalist solves the problem by selling these things abroad. In other words, they will put it in this form: the workers' wages and salaries will only buy back a certain amount of the product of industry, and the amount of the product of industry represented by surplus value can't be sold at home, so the capitalists sell it abroad. Now this is, of course, a self-evident absurdity. According to this theory, unsold goods are piling up not only in this country, but in every other country. If unsold surpluses are piling up in every country because the workers can't buy back, how on earth can the goods produced in one country be sold in another country? If British goods can't be sold in Britain, and German, French and American goods can't be sold in Germany, France and America, how can the workers in all of those countries buy imports from the other countries? Take this country, for example. In 1978, British exports totaled £37,000 million, but British imports totaled £41,000 million. Well, if the British capitalists had to export £37,000 million because the British workers couldn't afford to buy it, who are the people who buy the £41,000 million of imports? I mean, obviously, the thing just does not make sense. The final simple answer is that the imports of one country are the exports of another country. And if you look at capitalism as a whole, imports and exports are exactly the same thing. You're looking at the same thing from a different angle. In other words, there is no gap, and there is therefore no, so to speak, hole in which the capitalists can get rid of the goods that the working class can't buy in their particular country. In fact, the fact that some British industries export to Germany and some German industries export to Britain is no different from the fact that some London manufacturers also sell in Glasgow and some Glasgow manufacturers also sell in London. Well, I've never heard anybody suggest that the London manufacturers have to sell their goods in Glasgow because the British workers in London lack purchasing power, and the Glasgow manufacturers have to sell some of their goods in London because the Glasgow workers lack purchasing power. As I say, it just doesn't make sense. Actually, this erroneous idea that crises occur because the workers can't buy back the whole product of industry was known to Marx. It was put to him, and Marx gave his answer, and of course he showed the complete fallacy of it. If you look at Volume 2 of Capital, which is pages 4, 7, 5 and 6 in the co-edition, Marx pointed out that what in effect the people who hold this erroneous theory were saying, and I quote from Marx, they're saying that the evil would be remedied by giving the workers a larger share or raising their wages, which is of course what they do say. If you say the workers' purchasing power is too small and that causes a crisis, the obvious remedy would be to give them higher wages. And Marx answered this by pointing out that in the period of expansion and boom, workers do always get higher wages and do always get a larger share. I quote, "Wages rise generally and the working class actually get a larger share of the annual product intended for consumption." So that, as Marx said, if it was really true that crises happen because the workers' wages are too low, and if, therefore, putting up wages would prevent the crises ought never to happen, because in every boom, wages do rise and the workers do get a larger share of the goods produced for consumption. And what Marx said then is true now. If you look at the boom in 1971, 2, 3, you'll find that, I say the figures are wrong, I said 71 to 3, it's 72 to 75, wages and salaries increased from 83% of total consumers' expenditure in 1972 to 93% in 1975. Then it fell again. In other words, what Marx said in his day is still true. That in a boom, wages rise and the workers get a larger share, and therefore, if this theory was correct, the crisis ought not to happen. To get the whole thing into perspective, you have to recognize that while some products of industry are produced to be sold to the working class and are bought by the working class, some other products of industry are not produced to be sold to the workers, but are produced to be sold to the capitalists among themselves. Workers don't buy raw materials, they don't buy railway engines and aeroplanes and machinery and factories and things like these. These things have to be bought among the capitalists themselves. And some, of course, of the consumer goods are produced as luxury goods and other goods for capitalists. So you've got the capitalists buying all the producer goods, the machinery and things like this, and also the capitalists buying some of the consumer goods. So what has to be explained is why a boom suddenly turns into a crisis, and I'll come back to that again later. Now, I've dealt with one can't-buy-back theory. That's that the workers don't earn enough wages and salaries to buy the whole product of industry. But there is another can't-buy-back theory. It was started by John Gray in 1848, and it was carried on by Major Douglas, who founded the social credit movement in the 1930s. John Gray put it that in capitalism there is, and I quote, an underproduction of money, by which he meant that the total buying power of society is always insufficient to buy all the goods produced in society. But while the can't-buy-back theory I've already dealt with said the workers can't buy back, John Gray and Major Douglas held that the workers and the capitalists together can't buy back the whole product of industry. Major Douglas put his views in various places. If you're interested, you'll find he set it out in a book published in 1931 by Douglas called The Monopoly of Credit. And he wrote, and I quote, "The incomes paid out by industry are not sufficient to buy its own products, meaning that the wages and salaries of the workers plus the rent, interest and profits of the capitalist class, all added together, won't buy the product of industry." In his explanation of his theory, he based it on the supposition that, as he put it, the capitalist buys an article at one price and sells it at a higher price. Now, the first error made by Douglas is, of course, this is simply not true. The cotton spinning company doesn't buy raw cotton at one price and sell it at a higher price. The thing they sell is quite different from the thing they buy. The cotton spinning capitalist buys raw materials and labour power at one price and sells the finished product at a higher price, and the finished product sells at a higher price because it has a greater value than the raw materials and the labour power with which it started. It has a greater value because the workers create surplus value for the capitalists in the form of unpaid labour. Now, it's true that the workers' wages and salaries will not allow them also to buy the equivalent of surplus value, but the capitalist who owns the finished products, including the surplus value in them, then has correspondingly increased buying power, which he exercises in part by buying the kind of commodities, machinery, raw materials and so on, which the workers don't buy. Actually, Douglas provided the answer to his own theory. It showed the complete absurdity of it. He said that the result of capitalists buying at one price and selling at a higher price must inevitably produce a situation, and I quote, in which a small section of the community would own all the money and therefore the remainder of the community would be unable to pay, and production and sale would stop. And that's quite logical. If the capitalist does buy things at a low price and sell them at a high price, all the money will get into the hands of this small section of the community. Nobody else will have any money, nothing will be bought, and therefore production will cease. Well, Douglas wrote this in the Depression of 1931, and he believed that within a very short time this would happen, and that all the workers would be out of work. Of course, it never happened. It didn't happen then, it hasn't happened now, 50 years later. Figures published by the Government Statistical Office are an answer to Douglas on this alleged insufficiency of purchasing power. In 1978, the gross domestic product of this country totaled 141,000 million. Now, according to Douglas' theory, the buying power of the capitalists and workers together would be quite insufficient to buy 141,000 million of goods and services. But if you look at the other side of the picture, total of wages and salaries in 1978 was 97,000 million, profits were 22,000 million, and the incomes of the self-employed were 24,000 million. And if you add them up, you'll find they not only come to 141,000 million, they come to a slightly larger figure, because there was a certain amount of rundown of stocks. But so far as Douglas is concerned, the whole theory is wrong, that the total buying power of workers and capitalists and the self-employed were equal to the total gross domestic product of this country. Douglas's remedy, as I expect you all remember, was that since there is insufficient money in society, the government must make up the balance by distributing to all the citizens what Douglas called a national dividend. If any government had actually ever done this, all that it would have done, of course, would have been to have produced inflation. I now want to make some preliminary remarks about the idea of overproduction. Overproduction means, of course, producing too much. But you have to ask yourself, too much for what? And the first thing to notice is that capitalism never has and does not now produce enough for the needs of the whole world's population. Marx pointed out in his time that, in fact, capitalism produced too much for the world's population. It has never produced enough, and it's quite obvious that it doesn't produce enough now. But as Marx went on to say, capitalism isn't interested in the needs of starving people who have no money. Capitalism is only interested in people who have money and are therefore potential buyers. And as a general rule, capitalists do not allow overproduction to take place. That is to say, they try to avoid producing too much for the market to absorb at a profit. As soon as they see this happening in a particular industry, their immediate desire, of course, is to curtail production and see that they don't go on producing things on which they're going to make a loss. There are, however, three exceptions. The first was noted by Marx. He pointed out that there is one kind of necessary and continuous overproduction. Because of earthquakes, storms, floods, fires and crop failures, a lot of commodities that are produced never in fact reach the final buyer. They're destroyed in the process of it. And so, as Marx pointed out, capitalism always has to produce something more than the total demand of the market, and he called this overproduction. That's one of the meanings he attached to it. The second exception is this, that when capitalists have found that they're producing too much for their particular market and therefore are no longer going to make a profit on it, they will sometimes go on producing and storing the unsold goods. I think you've seen it reported in the press at the moment about unsold motor cars. But they only do it in the hope that before very long conditions will change and they'll be able to get back to selling it. And for quite obvious financial reasons, they can't go on doing it for long. Now, the third exception relates to governments. For political and military reasons, governments will buy up commodities and hold them off the market. This includes the strategic reserves of petrol, gold, and various other metals that may be needed in case of war. These are all surplus to the immediate demands of the market. So you do get these three exceptions to what you can take as a general rule that capitalists try to avoid producing goods surplus to the market's demand because they don't want to sell it at a loss. I now come to a simple and plausible explanation of crises, based, as the people who hold it would say, on overproduction. Their view is that there is a fixed and maximum total amount of all commodities that the markets can absorb, and that whenever this maximum is reached, there is a crisis. And the people who used it used the analogy of a pint pot. They looked on the increasing expansion of production like liquor being poured into a pint pot. And they say when it reaches the rim, it flows over, and then you have a crisis. Well, it disappeared to make sense, of course, to the followers of John Gray and of Major Douglas. For them, there is a total of commodities that can be produced and sold, because they think there's a shortage of money. So they would say, at the point where expanding production reaches the point where only the capitalists have any money and nobody else has any money, obviously production stops. But in the real world of capitalism, the pint pot theory is wrong for two reasons. The first is the total volume of production and sale in each boom has always been larger than in the previous boom. Or to put it in another way, the pint pot becomes a quart pot, and then the gallon pot. It's an irregular movement, but it has gone on for a couple of centuries, all through the history of capitalism. British capitalism's total production and sales, for example, at the present time are at least 4 times as great as they were 100 years ago when Marx was looking at the situation. The second reason why this pint pot theory is erroneous is that it is a mistake to think of capitalists all producing some similar kind of commodity for some huge world market. They are, in fact, each capitalist is producing a particular commodity for a particular market. Some of them are so specialized that, so to speak, there's a very limited amount that can go into that market. 2 or 3 years ago, there were some firms in Scotland organized to build reefs for North Sea oil, and they soon found they'd overproduced them. They then found there wasn't even a chance of selling them anywhere else in the world, apart from the transport difficulties. They were the wrong type. And this is true of capitalism generally, that most capitalists are producing a particular kind of commodity for a particular market. Consumer goods of various kinds for consumer markets, and production goods for particular production goods markets. In the boom which precedes each crisis, you don't have all capitalists suddenly finding that they have all produced enough or too much for their market. In a boom, what you find is some capitalists finding that they have produced too much for their particular market, while at the same time, in a boom, you'll find other capitalists unable to meet the orders they've received because they can't get raw materials and so on. And it's quite obvious that since that is the actual picture of capitalism, the pint pot idea is a fallacy, and it will not explain why crises take place. The next thing to notice about the use of the term crisis is that there are different kinds of upsets, all of them described as crises. One kind are financial, and the others arise out of the conditions of production. And these you can call, as Marx did, industrial or commercial crises. But it is complicated by the fact that when a purely financial crisis arises, it can have repercussions on production. And when an industrial or commercial crisis takes place, it will at some stage have side effects which are financial. You'll notice, by the way, that most modern economists and politicians think that all crises and depressions, incidentally, have monetary causes, like Maynard Keynes, who thought that if credit was properly controlled, there would be no more crises and depression. And like Thatcher and her government at the present time, who think that if only they could control inflation on the monetarist theories of Milton Friedman, they would get rid of depressions and crises and all would go smoothly in the future. Financial crises arise out of the very delicate balance of capitalist credit operations. Capitalists sell, but the normal thing is they don't get paid immediately, they only get paid after some lapse of time. And in that lapse of time, the capitalists who have sold and haven't got their money will borrow money from other people to meet their immediate needs and get credit from other capitalists. Now, if you imagine this great chain of debts and borrowing and loans and so on, credit operations, you've only got to get some factor which upsets the confidence of people in the continuation of this system to see that you will be in trouble. You may get a war or the overthrow of a government, or the bankruptcy of some big bank or commercial concern will destroy confidence and produce a financial crisis. And a financial crisis like that can have some repercussions on production. Now, Marx dealt with the question with a number of, having dealt with a number of untenable theories, what precisely is the cause of a crisis? Why do you get this sudden change round of a boom where everything seems to be sailing smoothly, and you suddenly find that people have become scared and are afraid that the thing is breaking down? Marx dealt with it by pointing out the fallacy in what is known as Say's law. J.B. Say, a French economist, coined a phrase which was, every seller brings a buyer to market. What he meant was that if everyone who sells a commodity is then in possession of money and can go and buy something else. If the capitalist sells something for £1,000, he can immediately spend that £1,000 on buying some other commodity. And which led J.B. Say to think that capitalism is a self-adjusting system. He could see no flaw in this. He assumed that everybody who had sold something and got money would immediately want to buy something else, and that therefore capitalism, except for very, very minor upsets, would be continuously tending towards full production and full employment. What Say overlooked was that the seller, having got his £1,000, may choose not to spend it immediately. And it is this gap between selling and buying which can cause a crisis. Marx put his view in Volume 1 of Capital, Chapter 3, it's the chapter on money or the circulation of commodities, and it's page 128 in the edition. He wrote, if the interval in time between the two complementary phases of the complete metamorphosis of a commodity becomes too great, if the split between the sale and the purchase becomes too pronounced, the intimate connection between them, their oneness, asserts itself by producing a crisis. Of course, he didn't mean that if this happens, if there's just one capitalist selling something and not buying something else. He was thinking of a situation in which, for the same kind of reason, a number of capitalists do this at the same time. It's interesting to notice, by the way, that Maynard Keynes also went into this business of the fallacy in J.B. Say's law, but Keynes never appears to have known, and certainly never acknowledged the fact that Marx had done it all 100 years before him. But we then have to ask, why is it that a number of manufacturers at the height of the boom suddenly curbed their investment and cut back production? And Marx gave his answer in Volume 3 of Capital, Chapter 30, it's page 568 in the Kerr edition. He first simplified the problem by saying, let's put aside financial crises and speculations, and let's assume for this purpose that capitalism consists entirely of industrial capitalists and wage workers. But he only did this just to simplify the statement of it. And he wrote this, he said, in that case a crisis could be explained only by a disproportion of production in various branches and by a disproportion of the consumption of the capitalists and the accumulation of their capitals. But as matters stand, the reproduction of their capitals invested in production depends largely upon the consuming power of the non-producing classes, while the consuming power of the labourers is handicapped partly by the laws of wages, partly by the fact that it can be exercised only so long as the labourers can be employed at a profit for the capitalist class. Now you will notice that Marx refers to two kinds of disproportion. First, the disproportion of production in various branches. Second, the disproportion of the consumption of the capitalists and the accumulation of their capitals. The first one refers to the two main departments of production, the production of means of production, machinery, raw materials, factories and so on, and the productions of means of consumption, food and clothing, the necessary consumer goods and luxury goods bought by the working class and the capitalists. Now these two departments obviously depend on each other. If the consumer goods industries stop buying machinery, raw materials and factories, the production goods industries are in trouble. And if the production goods industries can't sell their products, workers and capitalists in the production goods industries can't buy consumer goods. I mean, this is self-evident that they have to keep in some sort of harmony. There is, however, a significant difference between these two branches. In the consumer goods industries, the workers spend their wages buying consumer goods from the same body of capitalists, that's from the capitalists in the consumer industries. But in the producer goods industries, the capitalist can only get back the money he pays to his workers as wages indirectly. That is to say, by first selling production goods to fellow capitalists in another branch of production, either the consumer goods industries or the production goods industries. So the capitalist in the one case pays wages to his workers and the workers spend it in the consumer goods industries. In the other case, the capitalist pays wages to his workers and he can't get it back directly because the workers aren't going to spend it in the production goods industries, they're going to spend it in the consumer goods industries. Unless in this complicated way both branches keep in balance with each other, there is an upset which, if big enough, will cause a crisis. When you consider how production is actually planned, you will see that disproportion is absolutely inevitable. When each capitalist makes plans for future production, and he's got to do it in advance, I mean, you can't decide to produce more next Monday, you've got to make plans somewhat ahead. When he does this, and makes plans for future production, he doesn't really know how big the market for his product is going to be. And even if he did know, he doesn't know what his rivals are doing in their plans. He may try to guess at it, but he has no idea really what the other people are doing. And unforeseen events may make nonsense of all their plans, and they can't foresee this. I remember it was pointed out by Shell Oil Company, who really, so to speak, ought to know all about oil, that they completely failed to see that at some stage the oil-producing countries would band together, put up a united front, and shove up the price of oil. Now, if there's anybody who ought to know, it was Shell, and they admitted they were taken completely by surprise by it. In practice, in every expansion and boom, disproportion does arise between the various branches of production. Take the years 1968 and 1973 in this country. 73 was the end of a boom period. The government here publishes separate production figures for what it describes as investment goods industries, consumer goods industries, and intermediate industries. And if you take 1968 as a base year, and then look at how much the production in these three groups had increased by 1973, you get this. The investment goods industries had gone up 11%, the consumer goods industries had gone up 25%, and the intermediate ones had gone up by 12%. And if you look at the 2 years, the last 2 years of that phase, from 1971 to 73, the increase for various industries were as follows. For the whole of the investment industries, they went up 5%, or the whole of the consumer industries went up 16%. And for motor car manufacture, it only went up 2%. So here you can see this disproportion growing, and for quite obvious and necessary reasons. And, of course, it isn't as if the capitalists only have to worry about what's happening in this country. They've got to take a world view. I mean, look at steel production or shipbuilding or motor cars. They've got to try to guess what is happening in the rest of the world. It's quite obvious that in the late 60s and early 70s, the combined result of all the separate plans by all the capitalists all over the world was that there was a big overexpansion of iron and steel, shipbuilding, and motor cars. Now the question is asked, it was asked when Marx wrote, and it's still being asked, why can't it be arranged so that production goods industries and the consumer goods industries and all their subdivisions, why can't it be arranged that they all expand and keep in balance with each other? One reason is that the actual conditions that exist when a depression is beginning to expand. If you look at the middle of a depression, I mean, suppose you take the present situation in this country and imagine that perhaps in some months' time capitalism will start expanding again. Well, at this present moment, there are 1.5 million unemployed workers, there's lots of idle machinery, lots of factory space not being used. So when the capitalists start expanding, particularly consumer industries in this country, they can do so by using all the existing factory space and machinery. They won't have to invest more, getting more machinery from the production goods industry. So that will go ahead, and the production goods industries will be lagging behind, because at that point, not very many capitalists want to buy anything from them in the way of more machinery and more factory space. So in that first phase of expansion, the expansion of production goes on, and the production goods industries are left behind. Now there comes a later stage, if the expansion goes on, when the consumer goods industries will be going to the production goods industries and saying that we want more factory space, we want more factories, we want more machinery, and all the rest of it. And then you'll get a stage in each phase when both industries are, like the consumer goods industries and the production goods industries, are both booming together and competing with each other. And then you get the situation as existed in 1973, when you got lots of the British capitalists in 1970, more than half of them, were saying that they had more orders than they could fill. They couldn't fill them because they couldn't get enough steel, they couldn't get enough components, they couldn't get all sorts of things necessary for production. Now, the other disproportion Marx dealt with was what he called disproportion of the consumption of the capitalists and the accumulation of their capital. When there is overproduction for particular markets, in either of the production goods industries or the consumer goods industries, some surplus value that the capitalists had produced for them for the workers is in the form of commodities, and this is of no use to the capitalist, he's got to turn it into money. Well, if it happens, you see, that he's got some of this surplus value and can't turn it into money because of market conditions have been adverse, then the capitalists can't reproduce and accumulate their capital. This is what Marx had in mind. When this happens, capitalists sack some of their workers and stop investment plans, and you will notice Marx's wording. He talked about the non-producing classes. What Marx had in mind particularly then, and it is no longer true now, at the time Marx wrote, there was an enormous army of women and men, domestic servants and flunkies. And what Marx pointed out was, at the point where the capitalists can't turn their surplus value into money, I mean they're running into difficulties, he said the first thing they do, they cut their luxury expenditure, and in particular, they cut that particular form of luxury expenditure was the employment of this huge army of women and men, domestic servants they're thrown on the labour market. Well, that is no longer true because this great army of domestic servants doesn't exist. But it is still true, of course, that when the capitalist runs into difficulties, he does cut down his luxury expenditure, and he does sack workers. Another very important factor Marx said has to be taken into account, because the capitalists are competing with each other for the market, they're always trying to accumulate more and more capital. For example, by installing costly labour-saving machinery which will enable them to sell more cheaply. In other words, every capitalist, unless he wants to go under, is trying to become bigger. He's trying to enlarge the scale of his production, for the very good reason that the larger the scale of production, the smaller the unit cost of the things he's going to sell. Now, what Marx pointed out was that in the early days of capitalism, capitalists in the main produced for a demand in the market. But as capitalism developed, he said the capitalists are less and less producing in response to demand for product, and more increasing the scale of production as an end in itself. And that is, of course, true of capitalism generally. You either get larger or you fall back and you go under. And as has been shown in every period of expansion and boom in capitalism's history, disproportion has in fact produced crisis, and as Marx said, you can take it that this is inevitable. They certainly have Neither Marx's time nor since have they found any way of getting out of this dilemma that they're in. One thing that to notice is that you do not, in a boom, have all industries overproducing for their particular market. I've mentioned this already. The crisis is sparked off when a sufficient number of capitalists overproduced. In 1973, it was the motor cars, shipbuilding, and steel that sort of were in trouble first. At the height of the boom in the autumn of 1973, in the inquiry which is conducted periodically by the Financial Times, they brought this out in some figures they got. In the autumn of 1973, only 19% of companies reported that they were holding down production because they were short of orders. Over half the companies reported that they had more orders than they could meet, but they couldn't get the raw materials and the steel and the aluminium and the electrical components and plastics. Also, some of them were short of oil. You will also notice that overproduction, that is not another way of saying disproportion, or rather disproportion is not another way of saying overproduction. From the standpoint of the companies, which in the autumn of 1973 could not meet their orders because they were short of steel and other things, they would look at it and they say, look, the steel industry is too small, it ought to be larger. From the point of view of the steel industry would say, look, we're too large. But it simply depends on the way you look at it. Marx used disproportion because it covers both aspects. From the point of view of one lot of capitalists, the others haven't developed enough, and from the point of view of the other capitalists, the others have developed too much, as it were. They're both of them aspects of disproportion. Now, you notice, in the autumn of 1973, you had over 50% of the companies saying that they had more orders than they could meet, and they were short of steel and they were short of components. When the crisis happened, when some of the industries overproduced, start cutting back production, sacking workers, stop buying machinery and things like this, then you have a crisis. Immediately, everything goes into reverse. The steel industry, which appeared to be too small in the autumn of 1973, 6 months later, or even 3 or 4 months later, suddenly appears to be too large. There is now no shortage of workers, because we've got hundreds of thousands out of work. There is no shortage of materials. Everything is quite different. You will now see why I insisted at the beginning you want to recognize that a crisis is not a depression. The thing that causes a crisis is quite different from the thing that operates after the crisis has happened and when you are actually in a depression. It's the disproportion which sparks off the crisis. And at that time, during the boom, as Marx pointed out, wages are rising and the workers at that stage are getting a larger share of the consumer products. And it is in fact not that the workers' income is falling that causes the crisis, it's because the capitalists stop spending money. If you look at the period in the boom, workers' wages are rising and he's getting a larger share of consumer goods. So as Marx said, it can't be the workers' wages which are causing the crisis, but what actually causes the crisis is that the capitalists, at the height of a boom, those who overproduced for their particular market, suddenly stop spending. It doesn't mean they couldn't go on spending, but they decide not to, because they're not going to make a profit by additional investment and additional production. Once the crisis has happened and the depression begins, then the thing can spiral downwards. You see the capitalists who are first to be in trouble, so it's the motor industry, they stop producing cars, they stop buying steel, they stop buying components, then those workers are put out of work, then those workers can't buy as much consumer goods, and the thing can spread quite a long way, and of course it can last quite a long time. It's also, by the way, worth remembering that even in the depths of a depression, you will always find some industries doing very well. Just at the moment, you'll notice the oil companies getting peak profits, and incidentally the banks. And a few other industries, even at this present time, are doing very well and are expanding. Some economists who accepted Marx's view at the time did raise this question as to why couldn't disproportion be avoided. Once you knew that it was disproportion that caused the crisis, why couldn't the some arrangements be made to get rid of it. And one idea they had, Bernstein had it, and I rather think Kautsky does, although writing about it later on he sort of puts the blame on other people. One idea they had was, at the end of the 19th century, around 1900, a lot of international trusts and cartels would be formed. And the idea was put forward that if you had all the world's industries controlled by trusts and cartels, they would get together and they would be able to iron out all this disproportion, and then you'd have continuous prosperity, capitalism expanding, and never having any setback. Well, the first thing to notice, of course, is that unless these trusts and cartels have government backing to do whatever they may want to do, they have no capacity to do this. The trusts and cartels and the modern multilateral companies can't determine what is produced, where it's produced, how much is produced, and all the rest of it. They could only do this if they had government backing. And in any event, of course, the trusts and cartels, generally speaking, have a comparatively short life. They provoke opposition to themselves. So another suggestion made by these people about ironing out disproportion was, well, if the trusts couldn't do it, governments could do it. This is the Labour Party idea. Labour Party's grown up in the last 30 or 40 years on the idea of planning. And they would say the government will plan this thing to see that industries all keep in harmony. And you had, of course, that great fiasco of the Labour government, their national plan in 1964. And they thought they were planning this. And all they were in fact doing, they were just drawing up a lot of suggestions for industry, which had no real relation to what companies actually had to do. One of the things that followed after this, and the Tories were in it just as much as the Labour Party, they planned to expand the steel industry. In other words, they had observed on previous occasions that at certain periods there appears to be a shortage of steel, and so they said, well, look, we'll plan for an increased production of steel. And they in fact planned for the doubling of the capacity of the steel industry. And you notice what they are now doing is, having planned to double it, they are now planning to cut it back to half or even less than half again. So in any event, even if you think of government planning, again it's meaningless unless all the governments do it. The British government can't plan what's going to be the world market for cars, or the world market for steel, or oil, or anything else. It could only be done if the capitalist governments of the world all agreed to do it, and of course they have no intention or wish to do it. They have their own kind of priorities. The fact, for example, that at the present time in the industrialized countries there is an overcapacity in textile, steel, shipbuilding and motor cars doesn't prevent a whole range of other governments in the world who are themselves deliberately at this moment expanding their capacity to produce textiles, steel, motor cars and shipbuilding. In other words, they're doing it for political and military reasons. And they're quite uninterested. If the British capitalists would say to them, look, you don't need to build more shipyards and more steel works in various parts of the world, we can supply you with steel. Their answer is that they prefer to have it for both for political and military reasons inside their own boundaries, and they will go on doing it. One economist, writing in Lloyd's Bank Review a couple of years ago, went into this business and suggested a solution of his own. What he said was, since this disproportion does happen, since consumer industries expand and the expansion of the production goods industries lags behind, what the government needs to do is to prevent the consumer industries expanding so quickly, give the production goods industries time to catch up, and then you wouldn't get bottlenecks as in fact you do get in a boom when you get people unable to produce because they can't get materials. I would say that it's a complete non-starter for two reasons. Imagine a British government at a time when, say, there was a booming market for motor cars or for steel or for textiles or anything else. Imagine a British government going to the British capitalists and incidentally the British trade union and saying, look, we're going to hold back this production. We know you've got a what appears to be a very large and profitable market for your products, we're not going to let you take advantage of it. We're going to hold you back and give some other industries, the production goods industries, time to catch up. If the government, for political reasons, quite obviously, they couldn't do it, but if they did, they would immediately have it pointed out to them by the industries in question, look, if there is a great demand for motor cars at the present time, and we could sell British cars in this market, and you tell us not to, you tell us to hold it back, all that will happen is that foreign capitalists will push these things in the British market, and we'll lose the market permanently. We won't get it back afterwards. So I would say that though the idea may look all right on paper, it is in fact a non-starter. There is another popular misconception about what causes booms and depressions. It is that they're determined by armament expenditure. The people who hold this view say that if armaments expenditure is increased, you get a boom. If armament expenditure is cut, you get a depression. To start with, by the way, it assumes that there is something different in producing armaments from producing any other commodity. And of course there isn't, except the one that in the main the armaments are bought by government, otherwise it's just like anything else. And they also, by the way, don't notice, or it is worth noticing, that a very large part of what the government calls defence expenditure isn't on weapons. It's on the uniforms, the food, the housing, and the transport of the people in the armed forces. It doesn't matter to a clothing manufacturer whether he's making uniforms for soldiers, sailors and airmen, or whether he's making uniforms for postmen, busmen and railwaymen. From a capitalist point of view, it's exactly the same kind of thing. So when you actually look at what has happened, you'll see that the argument will not hold water. After World War II, all the governments involved in the war reduced their armament expenditure enormously. According to the theory, that ought to have produced an enormous army of unemployed. In this country, for example, in the year 1944-5, defence expenditure was 4,410 million, and unemployment at that time was 1.2%. By 1951, defence expenditure in this country had been cut by 3/4, down to 1,100 million, but unemployment was still 1.2%. All it meant was capitalism was going through a boom, and when capitalism is going through a boom, it doesn't make any difference whether part of it is armament expenditure or whether part isn't, or whether the thing is rising or falling. Or take an increase of armament expenditure. Between 1948 and 52, armament expenditure in this country was doubled from 770 to 1,400 million. But unemployment in 1952 was actually rather less than it had been in 1948. I don't need to, you could find many other examples. The simple fact is that capitalism goes through its booms, its crises, its depressions, irrespective of whether armament expenditure is high or low, or is rising or falling. I now want to say something about Louis Boudin, whose theoretical system of Karl Marx is otherwise quite a good one, that Boudin went wrong on this business of crises and depressions. He argued, incidentally, that he was putting Marx's view, but he wasn't really. Where Marx spoke about certain tendencies operating, Boudin treated them as if Marx was saying this must happen. Boudin argued that the proportion of the national income going to the working class must go on falling, and that the proportion going to surplus value must go on rising. Therefore, said Boudin, unemployment must continually get more and more, wages must be driven down nearer and nearer to subsistence level, surplus value becomes larger and larger and the workers can't buy it, so capitalism will be in a permanent depression and getting worse and worse. Now, all of Boudin's assumptions have proved to be wrong. Unemployment has not gone on getting larger and larger. It goes up and down as it always does in depressions and booms. Depression has not become permanent. Boudin was writing this in 1907, and there have been several quite normal booms since Boudin wrote. The share of the workers in the national income had not fallen, but had risen. Boudin didn't notice, there's no reason why he should have done, a factor that has operated, one I've mentioned before, that you have, unlike the 19th century, you now have an enormous army of bureaucrats, civil servants and local government staff, who've got to be paid wages, which in effect come out of surplus value. And the result has been that, as compared with Marx's day, the working class get a larger share of the total national income, the whole working class that is, than they did at that time. Marx didn't really hold this view, as Marx put even in a simple summary like value, price and profit. Marx said that the way the product is divided between workers and work capitalists, as between wages and profit, depends on the strength of the contending parties. And incidentally, of course, one of the changes that's taking place is that the trade unions are able to be more effective now than they were in the early days of capitalism. I also referred on a previous occasion, dealing with productivity, to the fact that, starting with Adam Smith, all the subsequent economists, or nearly all of them, have enormously exaggerated the rate at which workers' output increases. And this, of course, has distorted their view of what causes a crisis and what operates in a depression. Boudin enormously exaggerated. But you can say that all of them did. The people I've mentioned, John Gray, Major Douglas, Kautsky, Engels, Boudin, and a whole lot of other people, including, of course, Heinemann and the old Social Democratic Federation, John Strachey in his book that I've already referred to, and I'll say something about that again, and that recent book by Clive Jenkins and Sherman on the collapse of work. They make exactly the same error that Adam Smith and the others have made in calculating the increase in productivity. Even Marx did it, although not nearly to such an extent as Engels and others. Marx talked about an enormous increase in productivity, and in the years when Marx was writing Capital, that's in the 60s, 70s of the 19th century, the actual annual increase of output of the whole British working class was under 2% a year. Now, if it had been, say, 20% a year, you can see it would present an entirely different sort of problem. Strachey, by the way, worked out his theory that capitalism was in a state of imminent collapse. He based them on the Austin Motor Company, and he then said that this applies throughout industry, everywhere. They're all increasing at the same rate. And he, on the basis of these figures, he showed, or thought that he showed, that the output of the workers generally in this country was increasing at 20% a year. Well, the actual increase was under 1% a year for those years that he chose. They were the years in the 20s and early 30s. In the 20s, anyway, in the 1920s. The simple fact was that Kautsky, that Strachey, like Adam Smith and the others, did not understand how to calculate productivity. They all made this sort of mistake. So this is something you've got to bear in mind, that productivity does not increase at these great rates. In the last 20 years in this country, it's been about 2%, and it's possibly likely to be a bit more in the future. One other question to consider: an economist writing in Lloyd's Bank Review in July 1978 did some studies, and he suggested that in post-war years, the pattern is a crisis about every 7 to 11 years, with smaller upsets about every 3.5 years. The longest depression of all, of course, was the Great Depression, 1875 to 95. Nothing before or since has lasted as long as that. But I don't know any economist who, so to speak, has worked out any real useful theory that can enable you to forecast. Marx and Engels found they couldn't forecast, and I don't know anybody else who really can. And it is, so to speak, one of the facts of capitalist life. Capitalists in the main are always being taken by surprise by the crisis when it actually happens. There is one thing interesting to know. I don't suggest that it's worth going into, although it looks an interesting sort of thing. There was a Russian economist, Kondratiev, who advanced what is known as the long wave theory. It is that in addition to a cycle of about 10 years or so, that there is also a 50-year upward and downward wave. He based it on, his explanation was, it depends on some very complicated technical developments. He suggested, for example, that from 1780 to 1820, it was the steam engine that was dominating the situation. From 1844 to 74, the railway boom, and latterly the motor car and electricity. Certainly there does seem to be some sort of wave like this. I mean, if you look at the way depressions have operated, but I don't know any economist who's satisfied with the Kondratiev's explanation. I don't suggest that you need go into it. After all, 50 years is a long time. The reason why economists have reawakened their interest in this Russian is that in the last 30 years, nearly all the economists have worked on the assumption there wasn't going to be more depressions ever because of the theories of Keynes. Now they're finding that Keynes doesn't work. They're beginning to look around at other people, including this man. Incidentally, the result of his publishing his work in Russia was that he got sent to Siberia. The last question that this is worth looking at is, how does capitalism recover from a depression? Capitalism gets out of a depression when the capitalist starts expanding production and expanding investment. And they do that, of course, when they see a prospect of making a profit. They don't do it now. I mean, the 1.5 million unemployed now because the capitalists can't make any profit out of them. But a number of factors operate. One of the factors, Marx drew a lot of attention to this repeatedly, was bankruptcy. In a depression, a lot of firms go bankrupt. Well, it's a waste of capital, but it also gets competitors out of the way. When a capitalist in a particular line of business goes bankrupt, it does help to improve the prospects for the survivors. Unsold stocks that may get run down. At some stage, interest rates may be lower. The real wages of the workers always fall in a depression, which of course helps to is one of the factors in enabling the capitalist to see better prospect of making a profit. Because the fact that Marx referred to that in a boom, workers' wages are rising faster than production of consumer goods has one effect, of course, is that this rise in wages is cutting in the capitalist profit margins. The reverse takes place in a depression when wages come down, which may help to, at some stage, to give the capitalist hope that he's going to make a profit by starting production again. Raw materials frequently drop drastically in the depression. And of course the other factor, that Marx pointed out, is that new industries come along and some old industries get redeveloped. The silicon chip industries are now expanding fast. And in this country and a number of other countries, of course, the oil industry is absorbing thousands of millions of investment and expending. Coal is re-emerging. A lot of capitalists, including the oil companies, are now investing money in redeveloping coal and opening up coal mines. And, there's something like a railway boom in some of the third world countries. And, of course, a lot of development of communications, telephones and so on. I would say you don't need to pay too much attention to the gloomy prophets who tell you, that unemployment is going to be 2 million, 5 million, and the rest of it in a few years. They may be right, they may be wrong, but it's pure guesswork. And remember the speech made by Lord Randolph Churchill in the middle of the Great Depression, 1884, where Randolph Churchill, who later was Chancellor of the Exchequer, literally wrote off British industries. He said there was no British industry showing any prospect whatever of survival. He had, in fact, as it were, written off the revival of capitalism. But, of course, capitalism did revive and had subsequent booms and so on and more crises. I did refer at the beginning to some changes that have taken place since Marx wrote. They're not very important, but one, I've already mentioned, the enormous rise in the bureaucracy, who of course are a cost that the capitalists have to meet. They've got to pay wages and salaries to them. in the cost of administration. Trade unions are larger and more effective than they were in the early days of capitalism. And the introduction of unemployment pay and social security has altered one factor. In Marx's day, when a depression came, the workers were suddenly without wages, and they were, most of them, literally on the verge of starvation. So you had a very sharp and big drop in total working class income and expenditure. Well, owing to the unemployment pay and social security, the drop takes place now, but it isn't as drastic as it was at the time that Marx wrote. I think that's the end. I mean, on the face of it would seem as if they ought to be able to. They don't seem to have done very well. But what they can do in Russia, all state industries, so to speak, are on one budget. So if a particular industry in Russia is making a loss, it doesn't matter, it doesn't go out of business. They don't have bankruptcies. In other words, the government can use the total revenue it gets from all the state industries and use it to support an industry in difficulties, or use it to invest more capital in it. As long as the whole lot makes a profit, which they do, because they depend on it for their budget, a third of their income is profits of state in enterprises. But each particular one doesn't have to survive. Whereas in this country, there comes a point where, you read in your papers yesterday, if the American oil company, which owns the Observer, continues to make a profit, they'll close it down. And you see, that couldn't happen in Russia, because it's all run on the state budget. But the cost they pay, according to various people who've looked at it, is an enormous overmanning of industry, as they keep their unemployed on the payroll. The increase in productivity isn't a question of money or price. It's a question of measuring productivity in physical terms. In other words, if it takes 10 workers to produce a commodity and you can improve production methods and get it produced by 8 workers instead of 10, that's a physical thing. You don't have to go into questions of money or money supply or price or anything like this. And over British capitalism, for the last 20 years, the government published a thing every year, national income, a blue book. And they work out a figure, they make a calculation, a very complicated thing, but they have a lot of experience of it now. They work out, so to speak, what is the total physical output of British capitalism in a year. And they do it they carry it back for 20 years, in fact, you can go back right to 1938. And then they measure it against, or you can, measure it against the total number of workers. And on this basis, the workers' output increased in the last 20 years about 2% a year. Whereas Strachey and the others, and Adam Smith, didn't realize that that's the way you must work it out. They worked it out on another way, which is pure nonsense. Strachey worked his one out. One of his examples was the Austin Motor Company, and he measured the number of cars produced by Austin over a period of years and the number of workers employed in the factory, overlooking the fact, of course, that the bulk of the labour required to produce motor cars is not in the assembly plant at all. It's in producing the raw material, the iron ore, the steel, the glass, the rubber, and all the rest of it. It was the same mistake Adam Smith made, the same mistake Strachey made, and incidentally, it was obviously the same mistake Engels made. They didn't apply their own theory to it, so to speak. You've got to measure output in physical terms. I've already mentioned to you there are figures the government now produces where they incorporate the same mistake. They measure miners' output and agricultural workers' output by the amount of stuff produced each year, amount of coal, amount of food, and they measure it against the number of people employed on farms and in mines. Well, most miners and most agricultural workers don't now work on farms and in mines. They work in factories producing fertilizers and machinery and so on for the industry. And you've got to take that into account, measure on a physical basis, and they don't do it. Well, I did mention, I told you the capitalists are competing to expand the size of their production. This is what goes on. And when I mention the fact, you see, that the production industries lag behind the consumption, this is what goes on. And of course, I mention the fact that there's cheapness thereafter. So each one tries to expand the scale of his production because it reduces unit costs and we can then sell the thing more cheaply. The whole thing's obscured now, of course, by inflation, but it goes on all right. Well, they operate in competition, yes. I know, but then they're both, in both of them, they're all competing, all the capitalists are competing, you see, in both the consumer goods industries and the production goods industries. They're all competing with each other, and with foreign capitalists. But the imbalance, see, even apart from that, Marx does, in fact, the way Marx sets it out, he does deal with it first on the assumption that you haven't got this capitalist urge to expand the scale of production for its own sake. He treats it first as a simple proposition. But the imbalance, the disproportion will still happen. You'll still get certain industries overproducing for their particular market. I mean, suppose it's the motor car. If they overproduce for their particular market, they immediately stop production, start standing motors off, stop expanding their industry, and then if it's big enough, you've got a crisis. But then, as Marx says, as capitalism develops, it becomes more complicated because the capitalists are no longer producing in response to a demand for their product. They get to a stage where they're expanding for its own sake, because they either expand or they disappear.
On the question of production of arms to get out of the crisis, you said that not producing arms doesn't cause a crisis and producing arms doesn't produce boom. Well, doesn't it contribute towards keeping a stable economy? Because, for instance, if there is a crisis and the armaments manufacturers can convince governments that there isn't a profit to be made from producing more arms, or a defensive profit to be made from producing more arms, then that does provide jobs. It provides also good for things like the steel industry and, of course, the munitions industry and science and technological research. And I've heard the figure that within the next 5 years, the present British government is going to have to change all of the armaments it's got at the moment and build up new ones. Now, that only happens, I think, or at least it would seem, from the munitions industrialists' lobby, who constantly invent new weapons, sell them to one country, and then force another country to have to buy them in order to compete. And in that sense, can help them to buy their way out of the crisis.
You see, you're assuming that capitalists can buy themselves out of the crisis.
Well,
see, and they can't. The capitalists will only start expanding when they see a profit in it. Now, you say the armament lobby, of course, can make a profit out of armament, but look at it from the point of view of the rest of the capitalist class. The rest of the capitalist class don't want to help the armament people to make arms by increasing taxation spending on armaments. They try to resist it. They want to keep the cost as low as it possibly can. And remember this too, in a boom, the rest of the capitalists don't want the government to spend more on armaments. In 1950, the Labour government decided on a rearmament programme, and they announced they were going to spend, I forgot what the figure was, another 700 million or something like this, on armaments. A year later, the Prime Minister, Attlee, reported to the House of Commons they hadn't spent the money, and they hadn't increased the armaments, because they couldn't get Labour to do it. If they expanded armaments, the only way they could do it was by pulling workers out of the jobs they'd already got in other industries and putting them into armaments. So in fact, the thing hadn't happened. In short, there was a physical limit. In a boom, there was a physical limit to production. I've mentioned all these 50% of firms in 1973 who were complaining they got more orders than they could fill. They couldn't get raw materials, they couldn't get skilled workers, they couldn't get all the other things. They don't want the government to step in there and start producing armaments and make the situation worse. Now, it's in a depression they might look to do this, but then armament expenditure is no different, say, from increasing the size of the civil service. I mean, and it's the same sort of thing that happens.
Yeah, but well there are 2 points. One of them is I can't see any resistance within the capitalist class at the moment to expenditure on arms in order to defend their markets. I mean, a number of the top companies are directly supporting the Tory party's defence programme with funds. Others are supporting organisations that themselves support the Tory party. Many of them are supporting all kinds of sort of nationalistic movements, whipping up ideas of war. And I can see very little organised resistance from there. Not much from the working class, unfortunately, as well. But certainly, I haven't seen the signs. But the other thing is about causing the crisis is if the capitalist class or section of the capitalist class were large enough to say that they wanted to have, say, unilateral disarmament, I would say that would spell almost the final nail in the coffin of the British steel industry. It would affect certainly the British munitions industry, which I think is one of the largest exports from this country, and it would mean that a lot of capitalists would go to the war. So again, I would say that in itself could contribute towards at least a crisis of sorts in one area of British industry.
Well, I mean, you see, any change will cause a disturbance. But we're not talking about something which causes a disturbance, but something which causes a crisis which leads to a depression. I mean, and in fact, against it. I mentioned the fact that 1945 to 1951, armament expenditure was cut by 3/4. There was no depression. It's just like any other sort of expenditure. And when you say...
Oh, but cut by 3/4 in 45 to 51...
well, I mean, it was...
but that was a cut on wartime expenditure.
Exactly.
But wartime expenditure is always about 10 times more than peacetime expenditure. So 3/4 cut in expenditure between 45 and 51.
No, but wait a minute, you've forgotten. The people who use this argument, the Communist Party, said there will be a Great Depression because of cut in armament expenditure. They're not. This is their theory.
Oh, they did. But looking at peace, I mean, it was only a cut down to a normal peacetime.
But then what is the theory, you see? The theory put forward is that armament expenditure is different from other sorts of expenditure, and that if you're in a depression and you increase armament expenditure, you'll get out of the depression. Well, it didn't happen when they cut expenditure, and it didn't happen when they increased expenditure in 1950-51. There's a new rearmament program. One thing, of course, they couldn't increase expenditure because they couldn't get workers, they couldn't get materials. But when you say the capitalists as a whole are not interested in cutting expenditure, look what the Tories are doing. The Tories, it's true, are spending more on armaments, but at the same time they're cutting expenditure, trying to cut government taxation on everything else. But in the 19th century it was the Liberals who were in the government the whole half of the 19th century. It was their programme, peace, retrenchment and reform. And, of course, incidentally, on occasion, actually opposing war, like Lloyd George opposing Cold War. Capitalists don't want it. I mean, some of them may see a particular interest in the war, but the capitalist class also know they could pay for it. But it's just like any other expenditure. It has the same sorts of results if you, like spending more on the health service or increasing the size of the civil service. At the time it happens, that will create some more jobs. But over a period, it doesn't make any difference to capitalism's booms and depressions. Either it's a question of increasing it or decreasing it. The result is just the same. The capitalist lobby, I mean, there's an armament lobby, of course, there's the brewers' lobby and all sorts of other lobbies. But the rest of the capitalist class take a different view.
Didn't the German capitalist class under Hitler help to solve their problems by increasing arms expenditure, among other things?
They solved, yes, but which problem are you trying to solve? They were going to war. To go to war, they had to have armaments. But their other problem, and if you like their political problem, unemployed, they put the unemployed in uniform like Roosevelt did in America, in the conservation problem. That's rather a different matter. They had to support the unemployed, and they got them off the labour market by putting them into uniform, and Hitler and Roosevelt putting them in the conservation corps, taking them off the labour market. I mean, that solves their whatever problem they've got from unemployment as a problem. But I mean, see, why should armament expenditure be different from anything else? Any other form of expenditure? If you increase
it, because it's totally unnecessary. And therefore,
totally necessary. Capitalists can't do without armament expenditure.
They could do, yes, but there's no fixed amount that they require. In other words, they can when one side pushes up their armaments expenditure, the other side is forced to do it as well. And therefore the industry can force them through international competition into a compulsion to produce to a higher standard.
I mean, one obvious thing occurs to me, why didn't the armament industry succeed, and of course some of them are saying so, why didn't they succeed in maintaining armament expenditure at more or less the wartime level? Some of them were arguing for this, some of them were saying, look, this war's finished in 1945, it's going to resume very shortly, keep it up to wartime level. Well, from the armament expenditure point of view, okay, but not from the point of view of the capitalist class as a whole. But in any event, if this were true, you've got to show somewhere where it actually happened. You've got to show some depression that they've recovered from by increasing armament expenditure, or some depression that's been created by reducing armament expenditure. And capitalism takes practically no notice. There's always a little disturbance. I mean, if they cut the civil service drastically, of course there'll be a bit of a disturbance there. I don't think it does themselves. Maybe a difference in the way capitalism runs.
In relation to disproportion, you mentioned the silicon chip industry. I read the other day that the company which was supported by the national, what do they call it? The national organisation which gives money, National Enterprise Corp, isn't it? The company is gone into liquidation.
That's one of them, and
there are others, I know, but I mean the one that was supported by the government has gone into liquidation.
That's the one that General Electric were interested in and have walked out.
That's right. Yeah.
But in America, you see the silicon chip companies, people making it, and the people applying it to products after the time being doing very well. I mean, so it was inevitable. A new industry comes along until the time being. They do very well, and inevitably, within 2 or 3 years, they will have overproduced for that particular industry. This always happens.
Well, they were at the same time talking about another company, I think, partly owned by America, by some American company up in Leeds or Wolverhampton or something. It's got tremendous orders. It's a peculiar situation, though, isn't it? If you've got one that's supported by the government, supposed to be a boom industry, and they go bankrupt. They're in a bankruptcy.
Yes, but I mean, the GEC have got an argument here. GEC say that Britain's got in too late, and they can't now overtake the Americans. And so that the money they put into it will be chucked away.
Well, the others don't say that. They're starting up.
Well, naturally, people who are running the company, they don't say so. There is another school of people who argue precisely the opposite. They say, if only it wasn't spent on armaments, it could be usefully spent on developing British industry. Yeah, well, that is your point, but forget this, of course. If British capitalism disarms, British capitalism disappears. And of course, there's also another thing. Every now and then, all through the 19th century and in this century, the big capitalists of the world have at a certain stage got together to kind of reduce their armament expenditure. Like they did in the 1930s with the naval treaty. And one of the purposes of the SALT treaty, so that they can mutually agree to keep it from getting out of hand. Oh no, that isn't true. You see, the people who pushed it in the first place, when oil prices were about a fifth of what they are now, they had thought they'd got it worked out, they could make a profit. They might have been wrong, they might have made a mistake, but when oil prices doubled and doubled and doubled again, Concord was impossible to make a profit with it. About it being a very perfect machine, I mean, this is rather irrelevant from a capitalist point of view. You remember when Rolls-Royce went bust in 1971, but because they had a manager who thought that his job was making airplane engines and things like that. He was a technician, and his job was making profit, and he didn't know anything, he didn't know anything about that. Oh no, it is an important factor. And they've got various schemes for training unemployed people. I believe Sweden's a country that's done it more than anybody else, where they automatically, as soon as a man down to work, the government gives him retraining in other things. And the British government, in theory, have adopted the same principle, but they, so far, have produced very little result. even now in the midst of this depression, there are companies reporting they can't get skilled workers able to do their particular skill. One of the factors in this country is, of course, rent control. It destroys the mobility of the workers. If the worker wouldn't control the house and control rent, he's not going to move, no matter what the attraction is, he's not going to move to another town where he's got to pay an uncontrolled rent.
Could I come in this point? Our comrade here brought up the disproportion. You see, I always thought that the crisis being caused by the overproduction was wrong, and it was more a disproportion. But I thought the disproportion applied to the cash. I've got down here that you say the disproportion is between the productive goods and the consumer goods.
The industries producing them, yes.
And these are the things that clash and come up the walls. Well, I always thought it was the cash mechanism.
Well, in what way?
Misdirection, in other words, through investment, not through investment, in investment, misdirection of cash, and naturally being attracted towards the profitable industries, like say today, they would be going in for oil and gold and banks, starving the other, whether necessary or not, the building industry, the engineering industry, the steel industry, that in private hands, starving those sort of industries of necessary cash to them for expansion and new machinery or whatever is required, and therefore not even getting as far as you, what you call from the physical sort of situation, the actual goods. I thought that the whole crisis here took place even before the situation of production. It was a misdirection and a disproportion of the actual cash going in for investment. The difficulty in administering that cash, let me give you an idea of the London transport, where they have a physical problem of toing and throwing anything up to 10 million, certainly 8 million people, throughout London during most rush hour to get into the place of work. They're quite confident they can do it. This is the GLC, the Marketing and London Transport. But the thing that seems to be holding up the works is not the physical production of that service, but the cash administration, to a point where last week it's being put by some of the main councillors in the GLC. Look, the community is going to give up the bloody fares, open the door, let the people in and out, and you'll get them to work. Otherwise, if you keep on with this idea of 10 penny fares, 20 pence fares, 8 pennies, the whole thing's going to sort of come a crunch and break down.
Yeah, but all you're saying is that London transport can't pay its way because people are going to work in their own cars. They're not using transport. In other words, this is an unprofitable industry. But, you see, capitalism not only has to have the bankruptcy of unprofitable industries, it can't survive any other way. I mean, suppose you'd had Labour governments and carried out their ideas and tried to keep the canals going and the stagecoaches going and all the rest of it. You let them go past. And as Marx pointed out, this is how capitalism gets out of its periodical depression. Because they go bust. If they can't make a profit, who wants them? And if you don't do this, how do you develop new industries if you're keeping the old ones going by subsidising?
Because that's true, that complements my point, that either it's not the physical production of the thing. It's not the physical production of plumbers, bricklayers, and you can do all that. But somehow or other, they can neither get the money, or they've not got enough of the money.
But where's the money going to come from?
What's it going to be for?
Look, if they could make a profit out of London transport, they wouldn't have to go to the government and say, give us another 500 million. They'd go to the market and say, we're raising shares for London transport. The capitalists would invest their money. Capitalists won't invest their money in this because there's no profit in it.
They won't borrow any money either if they're not going to expand.
But how do you endorsing my point?
Well, I'm not really sure what... I don't really understand what you mean by disproportional cash. See, are you saying there's not enough cash?
For certain industries are not profitable.
Well, that's right. But this is how capitalism works. You can't have capitalism in which you keep unprofitable industries going.
Yes, but you see, if you speak about this, the clogging up of the due to the overproduction, I think you're speaking after the fact.
Look at the actual London Transport, of course, didn't really enter into this because London Transport has been subsidised for years. But look at the actual, take 1973, where money had been poured into the steel industry and expanded it, and they suddenly found they'd got twice as much steel as they wanted. It had been put into shipbuilding, and they found they'd got idle shipbuilding. It had been put into motor cars, and they found they got too many motor cars. This is how capitalism works. How would capitalism ever develop new industries if, on your line, they poured the money into the old ones and kept these lame ducks floating?
Well, the answer is they can't do that on the very disproportion.
No, but see, the disproportion is Marx's term, the disproportion between production goods industries and consumption goods industries. Unless they are keeping balance with each other, bound to trouble. You see, in order that the production goods industries and the consumption goods industries could keep in line, you've got to have the production goods industries able to sell enough of their machinery and factories and so on to the other industries every year to be able to pay wages to their workers to go and buy consumption goods. If they can't do it, you've got disproportion, you're in trouble. See, as soon as the motor car industry and shipbuilding overproduced in 1973, they started cutting back. The car people stopped producing cars and they stopped investing in cars. You would be appeared to say they ought to have invested more in it. But if they'd invested more in it, they'd have had still more overproduction.
No comment. No, I'm not trying to rectify I'm not trying to solve the problem by saying you can keep abreast this consumption and produce a goods. And then, of course, that's the crisis solved. What I'm saying is the crisis is not in the disproportion of the productive goods as opposed to consumer goods.
Wow.
I'm saying the proportion all the time isn't the actual cash challenge.
Yeah, but then see, where's the cash coming
you're
from?
saying that the people, if the consumer goods industries are doing well, the workers in the producer goods industries are idle, starving, and haven't got the money.
No.
The money to buy them.
Yeah, but that's your point. You must in fact be saying that somebody should subsidise these unprofitable industries, but where does the money come from? You see, what you'd have to be saying is that the capitalists and the profitable industries should give the government more money in taxation so that they could keep the lame ducks floating. But the profitable capitalists don't want the lame ducks kept floating.
Well, I'm not trying to cause a solution. All I can see is instead of this disproportion, an overproduction of consumer goods at any time, as opposed to an overproduction of production.
Or the reverse, by the way.
Or the reverse, if you like. I'm saying that at any time, crisis or otherwise, there's this constant and the disproportion of investment.
It's bound to be, isn't it?
I think the point.
If you've got a
the emphasis is on the manufacturing and not on the goods, isn't it?
There's no preposition.
Yes, but surely coming.
Well, just a moment.
Surely coming in the business is not because there is a how is it characteristic of the man? You see, because what the industry needs to say is only to its basis. You see,
Profit.
Yeah, well, being systematic. All right, he sees a problem. But it's a choice. Is it a choice or is it not? You see, he sees a profit or there is a profit. Okay?
No, well, he hopes there'll be a profit, so he'll invest it.
Well, it comes down to a choice. It's coming against this and because if one is withdrawing, you see, that change of money from one to put into the other. He starts with one, isn't it?
Yeah, because there's no profit in it.
Yes.
I mean, take my example of stage coaches. See, why haven't they kept the stage coaches going?
The question of choice, I think the best they are and with the other.
No, with road competition, they can't make the railways pay in this country. You know, in Canada, the railways are booming because distances are much longer. In this country, after the war, the Labour Party had a programme. They were going to keep all the heavy traffic off the roads and make them put it on the railways. But the road transport lobby was so strong, they got it killed. And so the railways can't pay. And it doesn't matter how much money you put into the railways, you're not going to make them pay. Not on the side there, they might possibly make a smaller railway system.
It's a big mistake to think
But it must be subsidising. You see, if there's no profit in it, the capitalists won't put their money in, so then the government's got to do it. And the only way the government can do it is taking money away from the capitalists who are making big profits and putting it into the industries where they can't make a profit. Oh yes, well they buy it from in the main the consumer industry, like the food manufacturers and the clothing manufacturers don't make their own machinery. They buy it from the production goods, and there is a certain amount of overlapping. And incidentally, why the government makes three divisions of it: investment goods, consumer goods, and what they call intermediate, in which curiously they put motor cars in the intermediate. I don't really know. I mean, they will have some reason. They've probably written it up somewhere. But I mean, when you think of the hundreds and hundreds of industries and subdivisions, when they're sitting down trying to work it out, they're going to be in some difficulties, and they allocate them one way or the other.
Okay, I have a question. I suspect it might be the last one I have time for, but I wonder if you would comment on the view that has been expressed in the Socialist Standard at least 2 or 3 times in the 1970s by one contemporary writer for it, that the markets of capitalism are contracting, and that the shrinking markets are now seem to be a feature of capitalism.
Well, particular markets contract, that the total market may have a setback in the depression, but it then expands again. This is the old Engels-Kautsky view, 1880s, where Engels said the market will never grow again, and Kautsky said the market will shrink. And I already mentioned British capitalism's market is at least 4 times as large now as it was in the 1880s. And if you look up United Nations statistics for the whole world, you'll find that the world market has continued to grow at a slower rate even during the Depression.
So you repudiate that analysis of crisis?
I think that it's, it's no explanation of a crisis. And may I put to you, there have people who held the view, and they put it in these forms, they said, look, the crisis is due to general overproduction. Incidentally, Marx used the term general overproduction, he meant something different, where they say that all industries are overproducing. Well, may I ask you to try to think to yourself, how can all industries be overproducing at the same moment? You see, one industry's production is another industry's market. If the motor car industry were to double, it doubles the market for components and all the rest of it. In other words, their market's increasing. So it seems to me that the idea that you can have all industries simultaneously overproducing is meaningless. Overproducing for what? Because if one overproduces, it increases the market for all the others. I mean, it is its product. You can't produce another 1 million motor cars without expanding the market for the components people in the steel industry and so on. And I think the term really is meaningless. That you cannot have general, simultaneous overproduction of everything. But you can, of course, have Marx's idea that it's overproduction for particular markets, and it's due to the disproportion of production in those different sections of industry. And I would like, by the way, to deal with one little bit that I didn't deal with tonight. It is something Marx dealt with, the idea that capitalism gets out of the depression by an expansion of bank lending. Marx said this is nonsense. It won't take long, but I would like to deal with that as well.